I am online live on the blog, The Washington Note, and I want to say hello to our viewers and watchers there. I'm Steve Clemens. I run the Foreign Policy National Security Programs here at the New America Foundation. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Eugene Jarecki. I want to say a few words about Eugene and introducing and encouraging you to read and buy. We have copies out there for purchase as well. The American Way of War, Guided Missiles, Misguided Men, and a Republic in Peril. Eugene Jarecki, of course, is a noted film director, award-winning director of The Trials of Henry Kissinger, and a film that was close to my heart and very much part of this book as well, called Why We Fight. And but let me tell you about the fun side of Eugene Jarecki. A lot of my friends know Eugene, and he's sort of this whirling dervish in New York, social cultural circles, and frazzles people in a good way, and has been struggling with this question about American security decisions, policy decisions, and how we, buy weapons, wage war, handle ourselves, and believes strongly that the American public needs more pipes into this process and decision making. We had a fun exchange, and I'm going to out it. I've written a little bit about it on the blog, so he knows this. But there was one point we became friends. He used Lawrence Wilkerson, who gave his famous speech, sort of condemning what he called the Rumsfeld cabal, Rumsfeld-Cheney cabal, right here at this podium on October 19th, 2005, and that opened sort of a whole new world for Larry Wilkerson's profile. And Eugene was quick to get him involved as well in this project and use him as a sounding board on all sorts of issues. But around this time, Eugene had gotten this film clip of John McCain. And you remember that? Is it okay I tell this story?
Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah, and John, and this film clip of the exchange with John McCain, where his interviewer is sitting and talking to John McCain about Iraq and about weapons contracting decisions and defense contracts, no-bid contracts. And John McCain is really, in a McCain way, getting kind of hyperventilated about how bad this is and that we should pursue this to the very top, and how awful this is for American interests. He's going on, and as he's going on and hyperventilating more and more, a phone call comes in, and it's Vice President Cheney online. His eyes go up, and this is on the clip. And at the time, John McCain's staff member, his foreign affairs advisor, and a writer who had helped John McCain on his various books, named Mark Salter, got pretty upset and tried to get this piece excised. What was very interesting for me is I know a lot of the close folks to the McCain campaign and had been involved with John McCain for years. And the McCain that I think Eugene Jarecki caught on tape was the John McCain I admired so much. He had that element of the Eisenhower DNA of concern for the country, of national security decisions that shouldn't be made in secret, etc. And there was a side of the McCain land that very much thought that what Eugene had done was great for them, and that they should essentially be running against Cheneyism. And then there was Mark Salter, who was on the other side of John McCain, saying, no, we want to love and embrace Dick Cheney's approach to national security decision making. And I thought it was one of the more important, provocative, elements captured on tape. But the debate that unfolded later, which I wrote on my blog, The Washington Note, was important, and I'm very happy that Eugene was able to tease this out. But it was a painful point, I know, for him, because he was under constant siege by these guys. Yes. But nonetheless, I wanted him to go out into Rolling Stone magazine and everywhere else where he published and make a huge deal about this, because the McCain camp was totally divided, if the truth be told, over whether or not to run completely where Eugene Jarecki was in that film. And it shows the power of the Jarecki film in reaching out to that sort of old Eisenhower lineage of concern about the military-industrial complex, and those who were on the other side of the war-fighting side, that this is something where we need to take the United States, in my view, recklessly into a different direction. And so Eugene Jarecki is a friend. He is a great thinker, writer, filmmaker, who's provoking our sensibilities and sensitivities about these decisions that are happening here. And without saying much more, I would love him to come share his ideas and thoughts, and then I'll moderate a discussion afterwards. So, Eugene Jarecki.
Thanks, Steve. It's hard to follow that. It's always difficult when your introducer is very eloquent. You then think, oh gosh, what will I say? It is true. The McCain story is true, and it can actually be viewed online. The clip is YouTubeable. If you just sort of put in McCain plus Why We Fight, you're bound to see one clip or another of this moment in the film. And the one thing I do want to say about that moment is it taught me a great deal, actually, about what I do as a political communicator, because there was no question to us when when we were editing the film that this was a significant moment in the film on a lot of levels, and it had to be handled in a way that was very elegant and caring toward the pursuit of truth and toward the pursuit of kind of what Werner Herzog, the documentarian, calls not the accountant's truth, but the ecstatic truth, the sort of truth beneath the surface. And beneath the surface of that scene was an idea. And the idea was interpreted by many people in many different ways. Some people saw that scene, i.e., very powerful senator is in mid-interview talking about Halliburton, of all things, and the phone rings, and it's Vice President Cheney, and he literally left the interview. Got up out of his chair, scrambled off screen with a lot of nervous stammering about, I guess I got to take the call, and there it went. And I had never had a subject leave an interview for a phone call before, and the interview didn't resume. So a lot of people looked at it, and sort of smug audience members said, "Oh, I guess Mr. Cheney had decided the interview had gone on long enough." This was the most sort of sarcastic remark we got, and I heard other people say, "Well, it just seems so sort of convenient and telling that the vice president should call." I just thought it was a moment that taught me that here is John McCain, who, in his best moments, as Steve has witnessed and been part of, and as people who know John McCain can testify, in his best moments, McCain does have that DNA of being a vigilant shepherd of the system who wants to see the system represent the best in us and not the least in us, and that there he is, with an idealistic person like me making a film, and he is reaching out to the crew who are all young people who clearly want to see a role model in him, and he's saying, yeah, we should put elements of the system on trial. We should be looking into this. There should be, as he said, a public investigation of what went on here. And all of a sudden the phone rings, and then all of a sudden he has to go scramble and take the call from arguably the most powerful man in the world. And that's pretty difficult. And my heart goes out to John McCain in that moment, as it does to so many people in the Washington community who find themselves, particularly if they're members of Congress, trapped in a kind of impossible devil's bargain where they, underneath that sort of ecstatic truth, the real truth of the system is that, just how far can you go to seek real change? Just how far can real change as a desire take us? And isn't that the theme of this coming week and the next 4 and hopefully 8 years of a hope for change, is that there's no question that in running as a candidate of change, Barack Obama has gotten us all to think it would be great to see some really significant, meaningful change. And so I guess that scene has a somewhat jaded eye on just how difficult it is to move a muscle in this town without being a stone's throw from forces of the status quo, who you then have to work with, dine with, interact with, make deals with, horse trade with. And when I started researching the book, The American Way of War, much of what I came to learn was about the depth of the corruption of the system, partly about how it got so corrupted, but also about the mechanics by which it's corrupted. And I'll give you a sort of case example, which if anyone has seen my film, Why We Fight, it may be slightly redundant of that, but I learned more about it in the time since I grew up a little bit. The B-1 bomber has a piece of it made in every single U.S. state. Now, that's a catchy phrase, right? Okay, so let's figure out what that means. Well, I only took Econ 101 in high school, but something tells me that building an aircraft and having a piece of it made in all of the 50 states of the United States is probably not an efficient way to build an aircraft. Just in terms of wanting to keep as little shipping as possible and joint storage and not having multiple air conditioning systems and multiple lighting systems and multiple computer systems and all the things that we all deal with if we run small businesses. Now imagine running 50 of them all across the country or more with all the contracting and subcontracting. All of a sudden there's so much overage in that I said, well, what is happening here? And I got to speak to people who were very knowledgeable about it, namely sort of Chuck Spinney, who's been a lifelong Pentagon analyst and sort of creative thinker who knew a great deal about the inner workings. And he taught me about something called political engineering. And for anyone who reads my book, has anyone ever heard the term political engineering before? For some Washingtonians, political engineering is something they know very well, and they either are part of it or they work to fight it or they work to expose it. I knew nothing about it. And so I said, well, Chuck, what's political engineering? And he said, well, basically that phenomenon of weapons systems, and increasingly it's not limited to defense, but let's talk about it as a defense phenomenon for the moment. Increasingly, it's a pattern that this idea that a system is built in many, many districts all across the country is not an accident. It's a designed, intended element of how you get a weapon system going and keep it going. Because the key is not just to get it going, the key is to make sure that when a system comes up for review, there is a built-in constituency in Congress that has a vested interest in keeping it going. And so you have surgically, it's kind of like the mafia families, you have surgically distributed the contracts around so that when a given system comes up for review, and there might be voices who would say, do we need this aircraft at this time? Those voices instead fall awfully silent, or if anything, they might cheer for its continuation. I give you as a sort of a sister example to the B-1 bomber, the famed, now legendary F-22 fighter. Let's say it in very simple terms. The F-22 is an air-to-air combat aircraft. We don't have an enemy with an air force. We've spent $70 billion on it to date at a time of incredible financial duress. And so it would be natural for voices of fiscal conservatism in Congress to say, should we be dumping more money into a boondoggle like this? Is this thing warranted? Is it a necessary part of America's defense? Well, the folks who make the F-22 have prearranged that it's being built in 44 U.S. states. So that when those kind of conversations might ever come to Capitol Hill, and it's rare when they do, but when they might ever come to Capitol Hill, a pre-constituency has already been assured for its perpetuation. Now what that tells me, I don't know what it tells all of you, but it tells me that there is an extremely insidious and dangerous force, a kind of a puppeteering force, running the way at least the decisions on those two aircraft are being made. And I assure you those are two examples of hundreds of systems every day whose perpetuation is being engineered, whose sensibility as an instrument of American defense could be deeply questioned. And even if you were a hawk, if you wanted to be the best hawk possible, the super hawk, the uber hawk, wouldn't you want to know that you were getting really good defense bang for your buck? And you're getting terrible defense bang for your buck in system after system after system. So this is an issue that unifies those who are not hawks, those who simply don't see it as part of America's DNA, that we and our national calling, that we should be so disproportionately guided toward militarism. But it also unifies those people with those people who are hawkish and would like to see America with the best and most efficient and most effective defense possible. And so you would think that since the issue of defense corruption and what it says about our country would be so unifying, you would think that we would be standing in a moment right now where, with Barack Obama coming into the White House with a moment of promise upon us, that we would feel very motivated and very captivated by the idea of significant Pentagon reform. You would then notice that Robert Gates was kept on as Secretary of Defense. That certainly didn't sound like a measure of reform. That sounded like a measure of maintaining the status quo. It's actually the first time in American history that a Secretary of Defense has been maintained from the opposing party by an incoming administration of the other party. And yet I learned something interesting, and this may sound a bit sardonic, but it actually does give us some measure of hope. As you may know, Robert Gates has in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, in the Jan-Feb issue, he has a quite remarkable essay written about sort of reshaping America's defense posture. The last time I read such a comprehensive essay about our defense posture, it was the 2000 Rebuilding America's Defenses, written by the Project for the New American Century, which I think isn't an organization anymore. If they are hanging out in the policy bullpen somewhere waiting for another era. But when they wrote their Rebuilding America's Defenses, it was a whole idea about the American empire and the need to put battle stations in outer space, a phrase they use, I kid you not. It really was part of why I spent the last 8 years worrying about where we were headed. It's in large part why the Bush administration was so tilted toward a war against Saddam Hussein and other very harebrained ideas. So when I saw Robert Gates's thing come along and say, well, I'm going to rebuild America's defenses now, and I'm going to reshape the thing, I got a little worried. But as I read the paper, I actually discovered that Robert Gates wrote a pretty reasonable, pretty smart, pretty thoughtful essay about the complex crossroads we're at, the need to do many things differently, and included in what he talked about doing differently was he talked very clearly, without using the phrase military-industrial complex, although he did actually use the phrase the American way of war, which is the title of my book, so I was very flattered. But in that essay, although I shouldn't be, it's a common term, shouldn't be mistaken for flattery. But in that essay, he did say he wanted to really do things even if they were inconvenient to the sort of status quo forces within the military-industrial congressional sector. And that's a very important thing that happened, because here's a Secretary of Defense that one would have thought, here's no change guy at all. He backed the Iraq War, he backed this, he backed that, he's been around for ages, certainly doesn't look like he's about to put the system on trial. And yet he's written an essay which I really encourage people to read, because it sets a pretty high standard for a new set of years and a new set of goals in the coming years. Then I noticed something interesting. It's in the January issue, and this is the part that might sound a little bit sardonic, and it's just interesting to note. If it's in the January issue, that means he couldn't have written it before, he had to have written it before, say, August or September, which means he certainly wrote it before he knew he was going to be Secretary of Defense. And that's not the first time that an American statesman of one kind or another, or any statesman in the world, has written an extremely blue sky document that he hopes his successor will have to live up to. And then all of a sudden, Barack Obama did the unexpected thing of appointing Secretary Gates to continue. And so now Secretary Gates essentially has to walk by the blueprint he has written for whatever unlucky sort was supposed to follow him. And that's a pretty exciting idea, because it means if we all indoctrinated ourselves with the vision that Robert Gates laid out in that essay, we have in black and white a standard by which to judge the pattern of this administration over the upcoming years. And that's a very important measure of policy progress for me. And I also say that it reminds me, of course, of my recurring love fest that I've been having with Dwight Eisenhower. And I don't think I ever thought, growing up in my very pro-FDR household, I was the son of Holocaust refugee Jews who had fled Nazi Germany and looked at FDR as a real idol. I don't know that I ever would have grown up to say, I think Eisenhower was a pretty remarkable president and probably the one who has the most to say about our contemporary condition. But he's the last guy who I remember writing something that his successor was supposed to deal with, namely Eisenhower's farewell address, which was made a couple of days from now, in 1961, as he was saying goodbye to the country. And in his last few moments, he warned us all about the military-industrial complex. As I later learned in researching the book, and there's a big chapter about Eisenhower in the book called Big White Men, and a couple of other chapters that follow on that. I learned in researching Eisenhower that the military-industrial complex warning has a couple of interesting qualities to it. The first is that the original formulation in his drafts of the farewell address that he worked on with Ralph Williams and with Malcolm Moos was not military-industrial complex, but rather military-industrial congressional complex. And at the last few set of drafts, Eisenhower removed the word congressional for sort of reasons of politesse at the time. He was very proud of his record in working with a Congress of the opposing party. He didn't want to be seen as taking a sort of swipe at the sitting Congress in his last moments in office. But it did us a great disservice, because it shows us that he recognized that what we're looking at in the dangerous undermining of policy in Washington is the force of a triangle, a military on one limb, industry on the other, and of course Congress almost on the base of the triangle. Because without Congress, military men, industrialists could want lots of things, but none of them would be achievable without the acquiescence and actually the active participation, the active collusion of members of Congress and systems like political engineering, where a map is drawn and contracts are intentionally divvied out across the districts to keep those Congress people under the thumb of one system or another, are just one example of the vulnerability that represents, the vulnerability that having Congress in that formulation represents. And frankly, for all of us as citizens, the reason I think it's a disservice that the word was removed is that we can't do anything about the military. I mean, I can go, throw my body at the gate of some military base somewhere, but they're just going to put me in a brig and tell my parents to come and get me. I can go to some defense corporation and tell them I really wish they didn't do what they would do, and they would say very plainly, we make things for the use of a country that we believe makes good judgments, and we have to trust that they do. We make the tools of war. We don't launch these things. Go talk to the boss. We're just functionaries in the system. And they'll also say some things about how their weapons save lives, because that's the nature of the sort of modern concept of warfare as espoused by those who need to go to sleep at night and think that they make weapons. And so I can do all that, but that's kind of useless. But I can write my congressman. So if Ike had told me to write my congressman, I could know to write my congressman. I could know to understand that's actually a point of vulnerability. You could say to a congressman, I don't like how you're voting. I think you're putting the need for jobs in the district above my actual direct concerns to you as your constituent. And the louder you do that, the congressman suddenly ends up in a cost-benefit analysis on taking the kind of positions that are being taken over and over. And so without going further down that line, I want to sort of enter into a dialogue with you, Steve, about where we stand at the moment, because in the largest measure, where I stand, having written this book, I was a filmmaker, I still am a filmmaker. When you make a movie, you become very deeply involved. It's kind of like a love affair. You don't just sort of hit and leave. You start to meet all these people. I met Steve through making the movie and then writing the book. I met Wilkerson. I met all these people, and I start to get very involved in the way they see the world. And stranger things have happened. I could imagine a day where I stop making films entirely and simply work for the progress of this side of our system, because frankly, this side of our system imperils the whole future of this republic. The subtitle of my book is Guided Missiles, Misguided Men, and a Republic in Peril. And so I take that very seriously, and so I did decide to take a bit of a detour from the movie making per se and to get into a more macro vision of this. But of course, here we stand at the moments of an inauguration impending, and I kind of feel like a guy who is at an NBA playoff game, and, it's the Lakers and the Celtics, and everybody's on the edge of their seat, and I'm standing somewhere in the middle of the crowd going, do you think the hoops should be higher? Because it's like people got taller. These guys dunk all the time. Like, there's no shots anymore. Like, should the court be longer because people statistically run faster now? Are we basically in this game, are we crashing into the constraints that were designed previously and we're violating them all the time? And if those constraints have now become archaic and outmoded, should we be changing them? Well, meanwhile, some guy's walking on cold beer here, cotton candy, whatever. Everybody's watching the game. Who wants to listen to this? And Steve and I were talking about this earlier. All we hear about right now in the season of an election is personalities. Is Obama going to be the real thing or not the real thing? What do we think of Hillary? What kind of dog should they buy? What school are they going to go to? What kind of nefarious machinations are the opposing party going to undertake to short-circuit things? These are not elements of deep policy. These are elements of topical, headline-driven news cycles. And they're killing us because this is the most sensitive time where transition team has been put together, where a cabinet is being put together, where the framework is being laid for the coming years. And I feel desperately driven to talk about the deeper issues here because we have a moment that ostensibly is about the deeper issues. So at great risk of feeling like we're putting a huge pedal on the brakes, I'm here today to talk about the deeper issues if we can. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Do I stay up to you?
Why don't you stay up? I'll wander with you and you talk, and I can have you sit. But I do want to offer a little bit of a commentary to myself. I care a lot about these issues, and I sort of feel like I've now officially reached the level at feeling like I am now finally not young anymore. I'm like the next generation because the issues I used to care about, whether it was trade or economic policy or these kinds of issues, have come back. A paper I wrote in college had a lot to do with the B-1 bomber contracting. It was a plane that wouldn't die. Jimmy Carter tried to kill it, got renamed, survived, came back. You touched on that. And to some degree, I see the Democratic Party, just to be clear, I'm an independent, but the Democratic Party, with which I think has engineered a transition which is important for American democracy, nonetheless has adopted new ornaments in the way it sort of animates and tries to reach out to the American public and its constituents with sort of a Trumanism. Truman Democrats, they call themselves, and others, of young people that they're trying to say, let's not fear the military. Let's be proponents of the deployment of power, and let's hug the Pentagon. And I think there's a real problem in this because for whatever reason, and I think it has a lot to do with polling, where Americans generally tend to trust less the Democratic Party in times of crisis and deploying power in sort of tough national security decisions than they have trusted Republicans. Democrats, to some degree, are organizing institutions to permit a sort of promote a kind of Pentagon hugging that does not advocate reform. Right. And when I look at it, no matter whether I'm with where Eugene is or Chalmers Johnson or others, I look at the fact that we spend more money on national security and defense, defending the country, than all other nations in the world combined today, and yet Americans don't feel safe. And so in that, there's got to be a management problem. Reform has got to be part of the package. But there's very few places in the American political scene today to advocate from that, which is why I think Why We Fight was such an important piece, because it reminded people of that Eisenhower strain of critical thinking. And just to put my own cards on the table, because Chalmers Johnson was there, Chalmers, in his books Blowback and also Sorrows of Empire, asserted that to some degree the United States organized its state, its national security needs along similar lines, for different reasons, but along similar lines as to what the Soviet Union did in terms of alliance or relationship building, in terms of the way it organized. And we were designed somewhat to sort of deal with what we perceived to be another massive global existential threat. That threat fell apart, but our capacity in the way we largely organize ourselves didn't. And one of the things I think is one of the big issues is whether or not today we are seeing the slow collapse of that infrastructure that we built up as the cost-benefit decisions of other nations allied with us change, and as the efficaciousness of the utility of the way in which we pursue security is producing fewer and fewer security deliverables with the resources thrown at it. So I do think we're at a point of transition, but this is not something that's often talked about in town. And when you look at the Bob Gates decision, a decision that I've decided to support on one level, because I think that the Obama administration has one single chance to jump through a loophole to take the country in a different direction that can return the United States to having some leverage in the world, and that is to find those sort of Nixon goes to China moments to put us into a strategically different direction than we're going today. And with that, having a Gates-Jones-Clinton alliance somewhat can work, but it's not going to be a reform group. They're not going to simultaneously take on ballistic missile defense, weaponization of space, the next generation of nuclear weapons, and do deep structural reforms of how we choose security while they're doing that. He's not going to have a fight with the generals at the same time he's trying to make these other moves. But I think the real crime would be is that he neither jumps towards these strategic shifts and doesn't have the fight with the generals, and that's a possible option. So that'll be my quick commentary on Eugene's talk. But let me open the floor now to other questions and comments, and Eugene may want to take some whacks at me after I gather questions. But let me open the floor. Yes, sir. And Brian is going to hand this mic around. Remember, we've got a lot of people. I've heard over 100 people watching online with us now. So identify yourself and join the conversation.
Oh, certainly. Hi, I'm David Blum. I'm from American University, but unaffiliated as well. In the film Good Night and Good Luck, at the end of the film, there are two endings. There's one in the time going on with Eisenhower speaking about military-industrial complex at the end of the speech, and then you also have I'm sorry, I forgot the
Murrow.
Ed Murrow, his discussion about the media and the fact that we're not educating our public. Do you think there's a continuation of where you said that Eisenhower left off the congressional part, but do you think nowadays we should include that congressional as well as the media? I haven't read the book. I haven't seen the
Sure.
movie. Do you think we're including the media? Because if you look at what's going on in the Iraq War, the media played a huge part in the fact that we rushed to this war. There was the compulsion to do it as fast as possible, and they are playing a part in this industrial complex as well.
I have, it's a very good question. Everybody heard the question? I have in my book at a certain point, I get to the point where I come up with some acronym for this thing, which is like military, industrial, political, media. It goes on and on. I have about 9 elements in there. And over the past, 5 or 6 years, while I've been making...
Come out as an understandable word?
Yes, FEMA. But, at the end of the day, I think what really happened in the course of it is that while I was researching the film Why We Fight and now the book American Way of War, I must have opened up the newspaper. Increasingly, by the way, I thought I was the only guy in town 7 years ago who was looking to bring back the blank, blank, blank industrial complex idea. And then all of a sudden, every magazine had the security industrial complex, the media industrial complex, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And the reality is, all of that spells out, to me, the same phenomenon in American culture right now, and in American societal history, which is we live in a corporate political complex in this country. I think to call it the simplest term of all, to get out of the tongue twisters that Eisenhower found himself in, is to understand that the defense industry, in a weird way, gets a bad rap for this military-industrial complex warning. Because what Eisenhower goes on to say in that address is actually far more broad in terms of the danger of what he says in the speech, which is, he says in no uncertain terms, the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. And he goes on to warn at a certain point, for example, about our institutes of higher learning, that if all the institutes of higher learning become outposts for the federal government to do R&D and for private corporations to do R&D, so they're getting all their money from these institutions, then all of a sudden the fountainhead of free ideas, he says, is imperiled. And he says we run the risk of having public policy held captive by, quote, a scientific technological elite, unquote. So there are things in the farewell address that are just, I urge people to Google the farewell address and read it, because Eisenhower covers a tremendous amount of ground in that address. And you start to learn when you study his career that that was not new for him. He'd been doing that kind of his whole life and his whole career. So it's not really fair to say he meant for other people to clean up his mess. If you ask Eisenhower, he would say, I spent 8 years in the White House stopping the Pentagon from running roughshod over American policy through these unsavory deals with weapons makers. And at the same time, this idea of whether the media is a part of that, of course. Every corporate interest in this country that can influence the decision-making of our congresspeople by doing political engineering of one form or another with those congresspeople is short-circuiting our ability to have a pure democracy, short-circuiting our ability to have faith in the soundness of those decisions. Because you know very well, if you ask me, how come you made such and such a decision in your life? And I say to you, well, I was always trying to sort of prove something to my parents, and then also I thought it was really important. You're like, whoa, let's go back to that prove something to your parents part. You got to get over that. You're a grown-up now. Like, you can't be. So you would try to get rid of the stupid reasons that I do things. And if a congressperson told you, well, I really believe it's in the interest of the American people that we have an air-to-air combat aircraft at a time where we don't have an enemy with an air force, you'd say, okay, but any other reason? Well, also, I've got to take care of the people in my well, you got to take care of the people in your district. Like, you can't be making national security decisions. You can't have really just said to me, you see what I mean? So you want in this situation to purify, because what's happening in the absence of that is there is a slippery slope between bad decisions being made in Washington that are profiteering decisions that are in the sort of joint interests of a congressperson and an industrialist in any field, military or other. Could be pharmaceutical, could be somebody whose heart medication isn't working because a funny deal was made and pressure was put on the FDA. There's a real circuit here. And when you see that happening, it's undermining our ability to make true, far-reaching, far-sighted decisions about policy.
More questions? Thank you. Yes, we're back here.
I'm John Alec. I've also written a book about this. The title is Trillions for Military Technology. I'm not going to talk about the book. I want to ask you a specific question. Your comments and Steve's comments have also made it clear that there's not a symmetrical set of power relationships between these various players. And I think we would probably agree that the military is the most powerful actor, in part because of continuity, in part because they're in a position to, not so much through secrecy, but just because they are professionals at what they do, waging war, and they're respected for that, and the American people support them. They are in a position to get what they want, whether it's the F-22, whether it's more nuclear-powered submarines. Congress has a difficult time dealing with that, even though they can match many of the generals and admirals in terms of memory and continuity and so on. For the civilian side of the Pentagon, it seems to me that it's almost impossible to manage what the military buys and how the military makes decisions on what we need as a nation to protect our national security. So how does one reform the military?
It's such an interesting question. It's such an interesting question because my own experience, and it's probably the bias of my own experience, which probably is a little different than yours. I have found that I ended up with a somewhat blameless analysis of this. I don't believe the military sort of owns a monopoly on why this is a problem. And that's not because, and I've had some remarkable dealings with people in the military to whom I owe a lot of my understanding of this. So, cards on the table, I've learned a great deal from people who've spent their lives career military, who talk to me both about the shortcomings of the procurement and acquisition system within the military, but also will talk to me about where the real engine for growth comes from. And I believe the engine for growth in that unfortunate way like cancers grow, I think the real engine for growth is the joint venture between Congress and industry. I don't, because in other words, we have this corrupt problem outside of the military issue. We have it in every walk of life. Every single area of American commerce right now, you can quote some remarkable aspect that is under siege due to the greed of particular actors who have curried favor with those who should regulate, and instead what we end up with is deregulated messes that we now have to clean up, bail out, and all those things. So the military, in a way, yes, they are an actor who is in concert with other actors in the military version of Wall Street, which is we are bankrupting ourselves through hardware just as much as we're bankrupting ourselves through ridiculous financial products and financial instruments, just as much as we're bankrupting ourselves through an inefficient healthcare system, and it goes on and on. All that inefficiency that is built into the cronyism of our system and that political engineering, which is so rampant, I don't hang that singularly on the military. Do I believe that the military within that apparatus has an incredible amount of power? Like, one of the things I did notice, and I agree with you in this sense very much, is that, this idea of the American way of war, which I used as my title, kept coming at me from all these people who run weapons companies and things like that. And what they wanted to say is the American way of war, which in World War II meant we bring industry to the battlefield, we bring mass production to the battlefield. Today they were kind of saying, well, we bring that American touch to the battlefield, which is we're surgical. And so I met with somebody at Raytheon, a very high-ranking person at Raytheon Missile Systems. And I said to her, she's actually in the film. Her name is Donna Ellington. And I said to her, can you tell me about, your smart bombs? And she said, well, it's terrific. In the first Gulf War, about 90% of the bombs we dropped were dumb bombs, and only 7 or 10% were smart bombs. So real civilian casualty danger there. And now you see in the current war, we're talking about like 63% of the bombs are smart bombs and the rest are dumb bombs. So that's a real improvement in our ability to be surgical. Well, meanwhile, back here in Washington, I was talking to people who were saying, yeah, but it's not so simple as that. Because what's really happening is that it's like buying a new car with great new brakes. What do? You drive faster. And you wheel around corners in civilian neighborhoods. And all of a sudden you're hot to trot in a way you weren't before. So the lawyers who were looking at bombing charts in the Pentagon they're lowering their threshold for what they consider a sound bombing practice. And so I said to her, naturally, having already had these conversations, I just very politely said, well, what do the statistics say? Now, it turns out the statistics on a per-day basis at that point in the war were much worse for this war than the Gulf War. And I said to her, sort of per bomb, how are the bombs themselves doing in terms of civilian casualty count? So I said to her, how do the statistics, reflect that? And it's on camera. She literally said to me, I actually haven't seen the statistics, but ... So I do believe there's an engine for growth and runaway militarism coming out of the false illusion of precision guidance that's been promoted by a joint venture of those who make these weapons and those who procure them. And I think that dangerous illusion is part of what greased the skids for us to end up in this insanity in Iraq. And of course, I fear it infecting the way we approach future conflicts like Afghanistan, that we start telling ourselves, oh, we're just hitting a cave here. And we have the ability to actually distinguish that.
My quick response, I sort of disagree with Eugene in a soft way. I think that public understanding and public awareness of these issues is important, but not definitive nor weighty enough to change the system. And thus, what will take it is malperformance, misperformance, mistakes, tragedies, and clear definitive losses for the way in which we've designed the machine. So ultimately, a collapse is the only thing that will lead to reform. That's probably where I am at. I don't think it's bad to educate people. I just think it's irrelevant to the outcome of what will largely happen. And I share that perspective in somewhat. There was a person, I need to keep this person, I need to not identify who this person is. There's a Democratic defense person who is known and will be a senior player in the Obama Pentagon, who some years ago I asked, what do you think the rounding error, the mistake, the round around the mistakes in weapons acquisitions that you make each year, that because of the corruption of the system, and as you were able to look back over your shoulder, what is the dollar amount of what you wish you hadn't done or couldn't have done? And this person said about $30 billion a year, which happens to be about the same amount that our whole foreign relations and diplomatic budget costs. And so as a rounding error, the mistakes made in the Pentagon, in this person's mind, was roughly the same amount. Now, it'd be nice to sort of look at ways in which you could sort of fine-tune that and get that right. But this person in a conference I was sitting at was also of the view of a lot of other progressive and Democratic Party defense intellectuals and players all believe that the Pentagon essentially was this fascinating machine that produced decisions and outcomes and made things that you just couldn't mess with. And I share that with you because that is the prevailing conventional wisdom among those folks who've just created a political transition in this country. And so I look at that as the reality that we're going to have. And so the notion that popular revolt or even popular awareness could change this, I think, is limited. So it's a soft, friendly distinction here.
And I don't actually disagree. And I realize in Steve actually answering your question that I didn't answer your question. I just addressed the part that was critical of the military in particular. But I will say one thing about it, which is that, yeah, by the time I got done writing the book, I figured there were 2 or 3 things I could immediately see ought to be made quick reform of. And 2 that are quick reforms, and they're all complex reforms, actually. The first one is, I think political engineering should be illegal. And I think it's very possible to make it illegal. I think if you were to put a standard in place that says to a contractor, we are going to audit the way you contract. So we are going to audit it with an effort to make it as efficient as possible for the use of taxpayer dollars. You would eliminate that contractor's ability to go out across the landscape and simply make their system as complicatedly and as widely distributed as possible. You'd say, show me the reason why that is practically necessary. I want to see the cheapest way of building this thing. And I think if you simply made it the cheapest way of building it and you force contractors to have that kind of bid environment, remember that thing before no bids? You would have the ability to police political engineering into a much more restrained place from where it currently is, where it's so rampant. That's one thing. The other thing I think is the age-old constant we keep coming back to about campaign finance reform. You know, if you were to shut campaign finance reform in this country off, if you were to create a system where you do not have this kind of industrial corruption of the political system, you would end up in a place where you have a much cleaner capacity to watch public policy decisions get made in soundness. Because what's happening right now is that decisions are not only being made under undue influence from corporate power and from the sort of bundling that pretends to hide corporate power but fails to do so. You would end up in a world where you have people who are making decisions much more closely related to what they think is best for their constituents and the country, rather than just what they think is indirectly good for their constituents in terms of job provision and money from some contractor of any kind, defense or other. I just keep wanting to take it away from defense because honestly, we could solve, if we could solve the defense problem, i.e. if we could get corruption out of the defense problem, we got 500 other industries to look at that are all currying favor. You think that the media companies aren't pulling the strings around the way policy in America works? You think that the Wall Street companies didn't have a remarkable ability to do that? It goes on, pharmaceutical, big pharma, it goes on and on. So I don't want to attack one. I'd rather attack, while we have a moment to breathe, a deeper corporate political crisis that we're facing that, frankly, our sister nations in Europe, many of them are not facing. The countries that do not have campaign finance problems the way we do are not having this conversation. They're having other conversations, but they're not having this one. They're also not collapsing in the same way we are.
Gentleman just to your left, and then we'll go right here. Didn't you have your hand up?
Well, you answered my question.
Oh, okay. Robert, and then.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Have you done any economic analysis in terms of comparing, let's say, defense spending versus other civilian spending? We've got 700 bases plus. I'm glad you mentioned someone mentioned the bailout. Everyone's upset, of course, about the $700 billion scheduled for a bailout of the financial industry here, but it should be noted that that's now what we're spending on an annual basis in the defense
Right.
budget. When we talk about the velocity of money and other economic measurements of how effectively and efficiently money is spent, have you devoted any time to any of those studies to compare the spending and the total good brought back to society?
Can I reflect on that? I have, and I had to do a bunch for the writing of the book, and I discovered that there's a bunch of trickery that goes on about how people work the numbers, that the left and the right both have their own mojo that they work with these numbers, and it takes a long time to sort of wade through that and find the truth in the matter. The left's version of events is they say when they're criticizing defense spending, they don't use the correct measurement that Steve used earlier, which is the United States spends more on defense than all other countries combined, which is enough to give you pause. It's enough for me to run for the hills if I think about the framers warning me about foreign entanglements and George Washington telling us we should absolutely fear and withdraw from the rise of overgrown military establishments because they're the enemy of Republican liberties. So it's enough what Steve said. But what critics of the defense sector tend too often to do is they'll use the following measure. They'll say, we spend more on defense than all other parts of the discretionary federal budget combined, meaning more than we spend on transportation, health, other things. And it gets into a fiddle, which is actually meant to make us not hear the word discretionary. Because if you actually look at what we spend on defense as a fraction of the total federal budget, it's something more like 20%. And I actually think that's a staggering figure when you look at other countries that are our allies spending 5%, 6%, 11% in China's case, but nobody's near that kind of figure. So it would be enough to impress me, but for the masses, you're not going, if you're going to get somebody to pay attention to this, you're not going to get them to pay attention if you say we spend a fifth of what we spend on defense, because it sounds like, well, it's a dangerous world, isn't it? So the left doesn't like to use that number. So instead they say we spend more than on all other parts of the discretionary federal budget combined. I think that's a tricky numbers game that I don't think helps. The proponents of the military-industrial sector and its never-ending growth do a different thing. They say we spend less as a function of GDP today on defense than we did in Eisenhower's day. And I heard this for a long time, and I didn't really know what it meant, so I went and looked it up, and I tried to struggle to understand it, and I realized it's another completely insane numbers game meant to confuse us all. All they did was choose something that skyrocketed, GDP, so that anything you compare to it will look like it shrunk. Arguably, you could have chosen American obesity. You could have said, we spend less as a function of American obesity today than we did in Eisenhower's time. True enough, meaningless, equally meaningless, but true. And so what it really highlights is a very dangerous confusion, which is my perfect answer to that would be, well, okay, if what you're saying is we spend less as a function of GDP, are you really saying that we should hitch what we spend on defense to our GDP? I.e., if our GDP drops to zero, has North Korea ceased to be a threat? Aren't we supposed to hitch what we spend on defense to the actual threats? Or are you, who's using that measure, confessing to me that we actually hitch it to some set of economic factors that don't have to do with defending the American people? So, having put that aside, my own sense of where the economics comes from really comes from Eisenhower. And I'll say this kind of, it's a broad view of your question about how to look at this issue of defense spending in the larger picture of our national solvency. Eisenhower, bear in mind, was more than anything else a fiscal conservative. Are you about to stop me? Okay. He was a fiscal conservative, and he saw his fiscal conservatism as really hand in glove with his military conservatism. And as a general, he was wildly more conservative than most of the people we have in Congress today. He was a person who looked at war as a true last resort, had seen it firsthand, was terribly shaken by his experience in World War II. You know, as you may or may not know, he wrote letters home to next of kin during that war to inform next of kin about the loss of their son or husband or father. And he did this in his own words because he never wanted to stray too far from the consequences of his decision-making. And I learned this from his own family. And what he came out of that war with, you see reflected in his presidency, and I think most of all in the lesson of today. I've been told that Barack Obama has had a copy of my book. He was spotted at the Pittsburgh campaign office with it under his arm, and I know he was given it by a staffer. What I would most want him to get out of my book at this inaugural moment is the wisdom of Eisenhower more broadly on the American story. Because the one thing Eisenhower offers us that almost no one talks about today, that is so crucial to bring back, is the idea of perfect security. Eisenhower believed there was no such thing as perfect security, that it was an illusion of civilians to think that you could ever have it, that anybody who'd ever been in the field understood that perfect security is a joke. We all know when we walk out of the house in the morning that we could get hit by a car, that anything could happen. And yet we don't stay home and we don't walk around with body armor. We accept a certain measure of risk as a fact of daily life. Eisenhower believed that countries have to do that also, and that you cannot have perfect security, but you can destroy yourself trying to pursue it. It's a bubble, and as you chase it around, you can trample everything in your path. He has a very beautiful phrase that came out of the White House years, several of them, of course, but one in particular where he said, the danger with that vain pursuit of perfect security is that you can, quote, destroy from within what you're trying to protect from without, unquote. So I take it as America lost her way because we started out modest and small with great hopes and ambitions and beautiful ideas. And it was understood to the framers that it was also a pretty big frontier with a lot of resources. And as Washington wrote in a letter back then, he said, one day we may be weighed in the scales of empires. And they knew there were some imperial prospects here, and they fought among themselves. And I go into this in the book, between the framers about the imperial on the one hand versus the isolationist on the other. And that's where this idea, don't get involved in foreign entanglements, came from. Because they understood that with that kind of expansion came deep threats to the fabric of the republic itself. That as you became bigger and started to station troops all over, you suddenly need to raise taxes. All of a sudden you need to have a more iron grip of the state against the citizen. And that dynamic they feared terribly. So we find ourselves now where the most important guidance Eisenhower gives us is that 200 years later, we have essentially lost sight of the role that national defense spending should play in the bigger picture of our national life. So he teaches us, that an uneducated country is undefended, that an unhealthy country is unfit for war or anything else, that a country with failing infrastructure gives comfort to enemies who see that we can't even save our own people from drowning in the streets, that a country that's financially insolvent will collapse under its own weight. What a more efficient way to destroy a country than to have to lift a finger. That what he saw in the bigger picture of our national life was what he called balance in and among national programs. And I'll say as a last comment on it, because it speaks so much to the last bunch of years, and I hope it speaks to Barack Obama as he enters these next years. Eisenhower said, crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is the recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could prove the miraculous solution to all current difficulties.
I'm going to take this gentleman here, then Phil Longman.
Ed Berger, let me just express a modestly contrary view and complementary to your own, but on the issue of where political weight stands on the defense matter. I would say that there's evidence that the generals, in fact, hold a larger part than you perhaps suggested. James Carroll's book, The House of War, whose father, you recall, was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, had written this very encyclopedic list of generals, in fact, over the years, who, in fact, supported the procurement process, the Curtis LeMays of history. Only yesterday, and this will show that I spent an awful lot, too much time at the New America Foundation, the discussion of nuclear weapons there was an impassioned speech by Joe Cincione, and the issue of the RRW came up, and Gates' speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, in which he strongly put himself behind the RRW, was a matter of discussion, and the issue of the generals behind that was a prominent matter of discussion, even names named. I would just propose that, in fact, the generals are expressing more weight in this perhaps than we're giving credit to.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Phil Longman, New America. Applaud your work. I just wanted to share with you something you might already know, but if not, it can be useful to you. What I know about military spending is mostly not at all with hardware. It's with things like healthcare and retirement. And I haven't looked at this recently, but I know when I did the calculation in 2000, that even then, the U.S. military was spending more on pensions than the total procurement budget. All right, there's a military retirement
Right.
system that really is a rock you don't want to turn over. It's
Yep.
really ugly. The military healthcare system, as distinct from the VA, is just unbelievable. I mean, if you look at it through an actuary's eyes, you will see that the Pentagon is basically loaded up like GM is, with all these incredible unfunded liabilities.
Right.
And if you want to approach this, those unfunded liabilities won't be used by some crazed general to blow up the world, but they are a serious part of the insolvency question, and the politics of it, of course, very different.
Right.
There's a tremendous case to be made for right now. A career retiree gets free health care for life, no co-pays at all, right? Plus PX access and all that stuff. It's unbelievable cozy world. And having stabbed at it a little bit back in the 80s, finding out what the Retired Officers Corporation can do to you it's just an incredible story. So I would just ask you to think about that, and I'd glad to share what you
Great.
know.
Yeah, would love to.
The only other point I want to make is one of the ways the United States is more or less unique is that we really don't have anything but a de facto industrial policy. And what that means is, if you sort of survey where the U.S. is still dominant in manufacturing, it's clearly related to our defense spending. So we make the world's best passenger jets still, right? And we invented the internet. And all of that comes out of
Yep.
military spending. So as we go to reform this thing, we should think about what's going to replace it, in terms of a formal industrial policy.
Yep.
So, thank you.
Diane Perlman?
Yeah, Diane
I should
Perlman.
wait for the mic. I should say that Phil Longman stole my thunder because Phil's been thinking a lot about these issues. But I wanted to say that as bad as it may be on the weapons procurement side, people cost a lot more.
That's true.
And one of the really interesting things about the incoming administration is its commitment to increase the size of the Pentagon by about 90,000 more troops before it's really done a broad strategic view of the objectives and purposes of that Pentagon. Thus, in my view, throwing lives and money and future obligations at a management challenge it hasn't figured out yet. But enough from me. Diane?
Okay. Hi, I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a clinical and political psychologist working on issues of nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and war also for about 25 years. And thank you very much for your work. Just a thought about a previous comment about security, that I think what I call cheaper, deeper security, the way to that is to drastically reduce desire of people to take revenge on us. But my question to you, that I've been working on psychological manipulation, which is completely complementary, which is necessary for to get people to accept this and to go to war, manipulation of threat and enemy
Yes.
images. And I have a question now about what's going on with Israel and Gaza, which people feel very differently inside as well as outside. And I'm also organizing a letter of conflict analysts. And is there any of this element, beyond the, hysteria, fear, paranoia, whatever, in Israel? Is there any element of weapon systems or any what you're talking about going
So
on?
the Israel-Gaza dimension.
The inner workings of Israel's own defense apparatus and its influence on politics is outside my pay grade. It just is. I'm not an expert in that. What I can tell you is how I view the dovetailing between the American system and what's happening there, but I'm not sure that's what you're asking. Well, I mean, I say this as, with all due respect, I say this as the child of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust family members who we lost. I think Israel is deeply damaging the credibility of their enterprise in the Middle East right now. And they are leaving their motivations open to question. And I think they are being cheered on by elements in America who are dangerously detached from what it means to be Jewish in the world. And I think are doing great disservice to the legacy of what Jews have come to represent in an understanding of world suffering, because Israel is allowing itself to be guided and misguided into being such a muscle man in that area, when the identity of Jews in the post-Holocaust world was the identity of people who knew very well the danger of muscle men. And my own family legacy is a testament to that, and so it pains me deeply to see the misguidance of policy that's taking place. That doesn't condone anything that Israel's adversaries are doing in that area or anything of the kind. But certainly U.S. policy has found it, I believe, convenient to have an aggressive Israel in the Middle East. And I would ask Israelis and American Jews and Americans who are concerned about this situation to think very deeply about whose interest an aggressive Israel is really in.
Let me respond, though, to one element of the industrial complex side with Israel, which I do know something about. In the 1990s, when I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman, there were two senators in the Senate who cared a lot about the activity of what's called defense industry offsets. And I don't know if you've written about offsets in the book, but it's a very important and understudied dimension of this ecosystem, in which Russ Feingold was the other that tried to create greater transparency. Essentially, an offset is a permitted defense industry kickback to another country that buys U.S. defense machinery and equipment and weapon systems. And thus, the notion is that since they're taking Saudi tax dollars or Saudi civic dollars and buying an AWACS plane, that as part of that arrangement, we will transfer technology or build part of the system abroad or engineer some other sort of deal that brings back and recycles some of those dollars purchased back to that country. You begin to see this permeate some of the private sector side, particularly Boeing, should be illegal actually, where you've got civilian kickbacks back to sort of Chinese or Japanese or Korean purchases of aircraft. So you've had a slow erosion of some of the manufacturing base and technology base in certain sectors driven by these large sales. What is interesting, and it's not recognizing the entire Israel issue, but it's something that it's important to put on the record, is that there are cases, there was a specific case in fact I know of, in which U.S. aid dollars to Israel, which come by form of defense aid in some cases, are used by Israel to come back and purchase American weapon systems. And in the negotiation for those American weapon systems, they also negotiate kickbacks using American tax dollars, so they get a double hit. They then create capacity, technology transfer, or whatnot, a job base in certain areas in this, in Israel. And there was a case in it with a radar system, and it happened to be one element where there was an American contractor. It had an operation in New Mexico that dealt with these sort of sophisticated radar systems. And Jeff Bingaman and I were in Korea, and the head of purchasing and acquisition for the military of the Republic of Korea did this odd thing that you don't do with senators. He actually asked the senators, anyway, you can get this contractor to come down in the U.S. because we want to buy American. But the Israeli side has a better deal. So not only had U.S. tax dollars gone to sort of help the Israelis buy American systems, negotiate the technology transfer and job-based transfer to Israel, but then that Israeli firm later became a competitor to the U.S. firm in a third-party country. It's a bizarre side of it, and it's not to say this is wrong, but there's almost no transparency, no understanding of these issues at all. And so the systems that we've had in place, which I think Eugene has identified beautifully, have spread around to other areas, particularly key allied countries. So it's not what we're seeing in the ecosystem that has evolved here in the U.S. Is not something that hasn't moved into other countries as well.
Right. Let's take another question. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Alfred Meyer. The mention of the Middle East brings up a concept that I'm very concerned about, and that is it seems to me that overwhelming military force isn't as effective as it used to be. The Middle East is a place where Israel has everything up to and including nuclear weapons, and yet they aren't winning. Vietnam would be another case where we, dropped more bombs in all of World War II on that tiny country. We didn't win. So I'm just wondering if in pursuit of our security, if you have any comments about how the American way of war might address this issue. It seems to me we need things other than military force to create security.
It's a great question, and to some extent, I'm going to combine an answer to your question with another part of the answer I wanted to give the gentleman over here, because this goes to what can we do to change things. And one of the other elements beyond illegalizing certain forms of obvious corruption in our system, from campaign finance corruption to the corruptions of political engineering, there's a much larger and fundamental change that happened to America in 1947 that I go into great detail in my book, which was the National Security Act of 1947. And I'm one of several, including Lawrence Wilkerson, who believes it's time for a new National Security Act. There are other people who think that things like national security acts are just Pandora's boxes of their own. There's worthy debate to be had about that. But in the current situation we're in, we are so off track and so on our way to hell in a handbasket. And part of the reason we are is that several things happened in 1947 that skewed the American system toward this kind of runaway and endless militarism. And I believe if we were to address it at a kind of statutory level like that, it could help. To be very brief, in 1947, in order to carry out the Truman Doctrine, basically, they added six really new instruments of policy to the U.S. government: the CIA, the Air Force, the Defense Department, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor. None of those posts existed before that. None of that concentration of power existed before that. And that was all concentrated in the executive branch, first of all. So it tilted power toward the executive branch. And in that tilting of power, all the tools given to the executive branch were military tools. Those are all tools of military policy. Those are not diplomatic tools. And so it stands to reason, as Steve pointed out earlier, that of all the money we spend on foreign affairs in America today, 93% is spent through the Department of Defense, 7% through the State Department. And so we find ourselves, I mean, it's a terrifying statistic for a country that's supposed to be opposed to foreign entanglements. So I would argue that the most significant step I would like to see taken, and this is again goes to this, as we look ahead to Afghanistan, as we look ahead to the Obama pre-administration talking about escalation there, it goes back to Eisenhower's concern about crises. We will always hear arguments why the next war is needed, necessary, important, and winnable. And very often they're not. And the hardest thing for a public figure to do is to say, you know what? I'm going to let that sore fester. I'm going to control it in a very modest way, but I'm not going to use it as grounds for escalation. I'm not going to dignify it with escalation. That would be the hardest position for Barack Obama to take today, and yet, as Dana Priest points out, when she says we might want to just start shuttling women out of the country and accept the Taliban as a fact, what would it be like to simply quarantine that region in a certain way, as we have done with other powers in history that we didn't quite know how to handle? Because what we're instead about to do is embark on yet another, what Eisenhower would call a massive, costly expenditure that is supposed to be a miracle solution to something that the Soviets spent 10 years to discover they couldn't solve. We're at year 7.
And many others before them. Eugene, I'm going to bring things to a close now. I want to recommend everyone, and we've got the books out there, and I want to give you all time to sort of talk to Eugene individually, recommend to those folks online to get yourself a copy of The American Way of War. Definitely, if you haven't seen it before, watch Why We Fight. Unbelievable film. We were very happy to be part of that early distribution and promotion. I think this issue that Eugene just said outlined of the importance of not being drawn in to this conflict and that conflict and allowing one's national security and foreign policy strategy to be hijacked by those who are pinpricking us and trying to react is the most important thing as we look forward. I'm so happy that you're saying it, because it will cripple the hopes that folks have for the Obama presidency very quickly, and robs from him the chance to sculpt some of these beasts in a different direction and to give them a definitive stamp that might take us forward. And that tension between reacting to crises that are out there and sculpting something that's distinctive and different and hopefully constructive and progressive is a really hard one, because it's hard when you're in those inner circles to not be drawn in exactly along the lines that Eugene said. So Eugene, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you back. Thanks all for joining us. We're going to take some books. Yeah, we're going to move you out there.